Are you looking for inspiring conversations about faith, film, and life? You're in the right place. Here's the host who knows the right questions to ask, Father Edward Looney.
Hey everybody, it's Father Edward Looney. I'm grateful that you're tuning in again for another episode of the podcast. Today I'm speaking with a priest, Father Damian Ference. He does some work with Word on Fire. He's also the vicar for evangelization for his archdiocese, and he's also a big fan of Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor is a name people are talking about right now because there's a new movie out called Wildcat. And I think probably this movie is going to lead people to want to learn more about Flannery O'Connor. And so I thought, why not have a little crash course in who Flannery O'Connor is? And Father Damian Ference is a great guest to do just that. So thanks so much, Father, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Father. It's a joy to be on your podcast.
Yeah, so maybe first things first, Flannery O'Connor, maybe a name people know a little bit. They're like, oh, I think I was supposed to have read a story by her, in high school or college or something. Maybe they've come across her name, but probably underappreciated by individuals. So who is Flannery O'Connor?
Yeah, so Flannery O'Connor is a 20th century short story writer, although she wrote 2 novels too. She was born March 25th, 1925. I mentioned the date, not to be nerdy, but to note that it's also the Feast of the Annunciation. And O'Connor was a cradle Catholic, a devout Catholic, and her art, her narrative art, is known to be incarnational and sacramental. And so I think mentioning the fact that she's born on the Feast of the Incarnation is important. So she grew up in Savannah, and then she went to college at Georgia Women's College in Milledgeville, which is now Georgia College and State University. She did college in 3 years because she stayed in school during the summers because it was during the war. And then she went up to the prestigious Writers' Workshop in Iowa and spent a couple years there. She was writing short stories and then working on her first novel. Made her way over to New York, where she thought she was going to remain, be a famous New York artist. But she wound up coming down with the same condition her father did, which was lupus. So when she was 15, her dad died of lupus. And when she was 25, she had the same disease and was diagnosed with it. So she had to come back to Georgia, and she moved in on a 500-acre farm, a working dairy farm with her mother, Regina. And for the last 14 years of her life, spent her days there writing wonderful and horrific and dark and funny short stories and fiction. She was highly disciplined. So every day she went to Mass, pretty much every day she went to Mass, then breakfast, and then sat at her desk from 9 to noon and wrote, including Sundays, because she was dying. And she died August 3rd, 1964, and then was buried the next day, August 4th, at Sacred Heart Parish in Milledgeville, Georgia. They say that there are many great Catholic writers, many good Catholic writers, but in terms of America, there's only been one great one, and that's Flannery. And her full name, by the way, is Mary Flannery O'Connor, but she dropped the Mary when she went up to Iowa because it was kind of a boys' club, and she wanted her art to be taken seriously and not discredited because she was a woman. So anyway, she's highly influential. Bruce Springsteen says the most important stories he ever read were hers. Influenced Josh Ritter, Bono, Lucinda Williams, Mary Goucher, obviously Ethan Hawke and Maya Hawke, who just made the film Wildcat. So a tremendous artist. And as time goes on, the more important she becomes.
Wow, that's incredible. So would you say that she was kind of unknown during her lifetime and kind of her popularity flourished after her death, or were her stories received with some reception during her lifetime?
Within literary circles, she was certainly well known. And within artistic circles, she was well known and respected. But as you saw in the film, Father, her family and many of her friends from Georgia just wish she would write a nice story that a lot of people would like. And I compare that to Ethan Hawke in making Wildcat. Like, O'Connor was not out to write bestsellers. And she said something like, many a bestseller could have been prevented by a good teacher. In other words, what everyone likes isn't always the best. And that's true of films too. Just because it's a blockbuster and everyone sees it, or if it's a good song and everyone's singing it, it doesn't mean it's actually good, right? Good art endures and it lasts. And so a film like Wildcat, I compare to a fiction of O'Connor. Some people may not understand it at first or may not get it at first, but like you said, you watched it a second time and then things started to click and started to make sense. That's often how her fiction is. Most people do not like her upon first read. It's an acquired, it's maybe like coffee or bourbon or something. It's good, but you don't know it's good until you know what to look for, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, for me, I sat down, I actually had another priest who was visiting. And so it was late though. It was like 9 o'clock at night. We're trying to watch this movie, but it was just, for me, I was super tired. I fell asleep a few times. I'm like, I don't understand it. But then I turned it on again last night. And I watched it. I'm like, this is really profound, and especially the cinematic artistry and everything like that. So, yeah, I really did, as you said, came to appreciate it the second time, and I'm sure a third viewing would probably yield even more appreciation for it. So you are kind of, I think, a Flannery O'Connor scholar in a sense. You've written a book with Word on Fire. Called Understanding the Hillbilly Thomist. So, and that Hillbilly Thomist is Flannery O'Connor. So, where did you, or when did you in your life really become interested in reading Flannery O'Connor? Like, how did you discover her, and why did you fall in love with her writing?
Yeah, good question. So I went to college seminary, and here in Cleveland, our college seminary is partnered with John Carroll University, which is in University Heights, a eastern suburb here. And my senior year, I took a course with a guy named George Bill Gare, who's a well-published poet. It was a poetry workshop class, and every week we had to write a couple poems in addition to a big poetry project. And he'd pick a poem every week to workshop. And one week he picked my poem. And he said, Damian's poem's dark, and it reminds me of Flannery O'Connor. And I thought, ooh, and I got out my pen and I wrote down Flannery O'Connor, and I figured I gotta figure out who this guy is later on tonight. I didn't want to, embarrass myself and ask in class. And then it turns out that he was a she. And I knew the name because I'm a big Springsteen fan, and Springsteen had mentioned her before. So that summer I started to read her stories. And again, I liked them. The writing's excellent. There was a lot of violence, and it was dark, and it was also funny. I compare O'Connor to the Coen brothers, like Fargo and Big Lebowski and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Those kind of films that are funny, and they can be dark, or what's the Ballad of Buster Scruggs, another good one. So I liked that type of storytelling. I like the style, and so I kept reading her. And when I went to major seminary, I started to dive into her essays. And then she has a whole book of letters called The Habit of Being. It's almost 700 pages long. And my mom at the time was in her final year of life, and she was living at a cancer home in Cleveland, Ohio, run by the Hawthorne Dominican Sisters. So Nathaniel Hawthorne's daughter started this order. As it turns out, I went in and told my mom's nurse nun about the book I was reading, and she says, "Who you reading, Flannery?" And I said, "Yeah, how did you know?" And she said, "I knew her because when Sister Kevin was a young nun, her first assignment was down in Atlanta, Georgia, and she used to visit Flannery's farm. So the woman who was taking care of my mom as she was dying knew Flannery O'Connor." So I feel as if Flannery has been calling me. It's like my vocation within my priestly vocation to do this work and research on her. So I wrote some papers on her when I was in grad school at seminary, and then at CUA, taught some independent studies on her when I was at seminary. And then when Bishop Perez at the time sent me to Rome, I had to figure out where I was going to study and who I was going to write on or what I was going to write on. And my dream was, if I could find someone to direct a dissertation on Flannery O'Connor, that would be it, because that's a great love of my life. And as it turns out, the same semester I arrived in Rome, a Dominican priest by the name of Thomas Joseph White who's now the rector of the Angelicum. He's also one of the founding members of the Hillbilly Thomists, was started on faculty there at the Ange. And he's from Georgia, a convert to the faith, and part of his conversion came by reading O'Connor. So, I mean, it was like all the stars were lining up, providence, not coincidence. And I asked him if he would be willing to direct, and he said, how could I say no? And so my last 2 years of doctoral studies, after I got through my coursework and Lectio Corum, it was writing under his tutelage, and got the dissertation done. Then when I came back, revised it, Word on Fire wanted to publish it as a book. So a revision of it is published with Word on Fire. And that's how it came to be. That's the story.
So Hillbilly Thomist, what's that about? You know, obviously there's that band of the Dominican Friars,
Yeah.
but this is something attributed to Flannery O'Connor, right?
Yes. So upon reading her first novel, someone called her, a reviewer called her a hillbilly nihilist. She took offense to the nihilist part, not the hillbilly part, because she was from the hills of, well, not the hills, but she's from Georgia. And she did have a deep Southern accent. So full was her accent, by the way, that when she went to Iowa, people couldn't understand her. So she didn't mind the hillbilly part. She minded the nihilist part, but she loved St. Thomas Aquinas, claimed to have read him every night for 20 minutes before she went to bed. And so she called herself, she said, I'd rather be a hillbilly Thomist. So I like that title. I was at the Angelicum, which is the like center for Thomistic learning in the world, right? It's the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in the city, otherwise known as the Ange. And I thought it would be appropriate to write my dissertation on the Hillbilly Thomist there. And in fact, if you look at the cover of my book, it is a homage to the logo of the Angelicum. So if you look at the logo of the Angelicum, it's an image of St. Thomas Aquinas in a circle. He's got a halo over his head, a quill because he's a doctor of the church writing a book. And then on top, because it's a pontifical school, there are 2 keys for Peter and the papal tiara. And on the cover of my book, it's a hillbilly hat instead of the papal tiara, 2 banjos. And then O'Connor she doesn't have a halo because she's not a canonized saint. She does have a feather, but it's a peacock feather because she loved peacocks and had over 40 of them on her farm. So yeah, the cover of the book is an homage to the Angelicum.
Yeah, that's incredible. So you said like that people couldn't understand her when she went to Iowa. I think people pick up her story sometimes and they're like, I don't understand her. Your whole book is called Understanding the Hillbilly Thomist.
Right.
So like, what is the key to understanding her then? Like understanding this worldview that she writes in and presents. Obviously there's a faith base, there's sacraments, there's that there, but yeah, what's one of the major keys, would you say?
Well, my book has 4 chapters, so it's an introduction to her. And then basically the 3 major branches of philosophy. So her metaphysics, that's her worldview. Like, what is reality according to O'Connor? And everything starts with God and ends with God. So she's a Thomist in that way, right? And Jesus comes to show us who God is. And in showing us who he is, he shows us who we are, and we make ourselves way back to God in that way. So every one of her stories, she says, is about grace being offered. Sometimes her characters accept it, sometimes they reject it, and sometimes at the end we're wondering, did they accept it, or is there hope? Second is epistemology. That's how we come to knowledge of the world. As a Thomist, she believed that our knowledge always begins with the senses. It's not abstract, and we have to work our way through things. So matter matters, stuff matters. What we see, what we feel, what we taste, what we touch, what we smell matters. And you know that as a Catholic, how important the senses are. It doesn't end there, but knowledge begins there. And then the third is her ethics. And I spent a lot of time there and talking about virtue, and especially friendship, because friendship was so important to her. Friendship with God, friendship with oneself, friendship with others. And we're made for friendship. We're made for communion with God. So I think when you know all those things, and I rely on her letters and her essays and her stories and her letters, you start to say, okay, I get what she's doing here. I understand the project. I equate it to this. If you were never Catholic and didn't know anything about the church, and you went to a high mass or something, a fancy liturgy, at first you'd be like, I don't know what's going on here. I know there's something good going on here, but I don't understand it at all. That's kind of like how it is reading an O'Connor story. And so you need to study and figure out what she's doing. But the more you understand what's happening, the more the thing opens up to you and the more you like it.
No, I think that's definitely a good way to kind of frame it, and to help people to realize, if I do pick up Flannery O'Connor, I might not understand this, but maybe upon the second reading, I will understand this. Or, you turn to a resource. I don't get what she's doing in this story. So what have other people opined or written about? So you almost need kind of the interpretive key then to try to know what she's writing about or understand the central points that she's presenting.
Yes, indeed.
Now, so there's this new movie out. It's called Wildcat. It kind of, it's an interesting thing that, most times they say this movie will be released on May 28th or something like that. Like there's a definitive date. But this movie is one of those that has had kind of like a rolling release where, like, in certain parts it was released early May, other places it started May 17th. So it might not be in the theater where you're at right now, but it probably will be coming there. But what's your impression of the movie? You've seen it 4 times, you said. So I guess what strikes you about it? What's moving about it? Because it's a little bit jarring in a sense, because you have the life of Flannery O'Connor, but then you have like her short stories that are kind of being played out too. And so if you're watching it like I was, admittedly, I don't think I've read any Flannery O'Connor. If I have, I don't remember any of it. So shame on me. I will pick up a book. I will read it. But yeah, so you have her short stories, and they're kind of like moving scenes within the major movies. So it could be a bit confusing at times if you don't know the stories, I think. But yeah, what's your impression overall of Wildcat?
Yeah, I did write a review for Word on Fire, so I can send it to you. And if you have show notes, you can link it.
For sure.
My summary is this, that it's an awful lot like her fiction. And that is, upon first viewing, unless you know her stuff well, it may be confusing and you may not understand it, but you'll still think there's something about it that's alluring, that's attractive, that's good. Now, I've been studying O'Connor for 25 years, so every one of those stories, I was like, "Oh, look at that." Like at the beginning, it's the comforts of home. That's the black and white, that's the trailer. Or The Life You Say May Be Your Own, or Good Country People, or A Revelation, or Parker's Back. So what Ethan Hawke has done here is he's told the story of Flannery O'Connor. And by the way, we should mention his daughter, Maya Hawke, plays Flannery O'Connor in the film. Okay. But in addition to telling her biography, and he's not telling her whole life, he's telling like her in her early 20s as she's trying to get her first novel published. He's using 6 or 7 short stories to help tell the story of O'Connor's life. And in each one of those stories, you have Maya Hawke and a few other actors who are also double role playing. So they're playing different characters throughout the film, which makes it very interesting and exciting. My understanding, my takeaway from the film is this. Flannery O'Connor's most famous story was, or is, A Good Man's Hard to Find, and that's about a guy named the Misfit who basically assassinates a whole family. The last person he's with is the grandmother, and then he takes her out. But his name is the Misfit because he doesn't fit in anywhere. And I think this story is about Flannery O'Connor, who also is a misfit, and she doesn't fit in anywhere. So if you remember, when she goes up to Iowa, it's mostly men who are in her program. They're Northerners for the most part. They're non-believers, if they do believe in God, not to the degree that she does. And she's not promiscuous, and she's not a drinker. So she doesn't fit in up there. And then when she has to come back down to Georgia, her family, especially her mother and some of her cousins, they really don't understand her work. She no longer has the intellectuals around her to bounce ideas off of or to share her thoughts. And so she feels, again, like she doesn't fit in. But the one place she definitely fits in, especially with her own suffering, is in the life of the church. And I think what I refer to in my review is she looks at the crucified misfit, because Jesus himself although he came to save us all, really didn't fit here either. And when we find ourselves as misfits because of our own sin and our own suffering, that's when we're able to like dive into his misfittedness and his great love and allow him to enter in and have union with him. So that's my take on the film. I think whether or not Ethan Hawke was intending to do that, his artistic intuition took him there, and that film did that. I don't know about you, Father, but that scene where Flannery is with her priest, who's played by Liam Neeson.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I cry. I mean, I didn't bawl the last time, but I was still pretty misty-eyed. I looked to one of my friends who I watched the film with, and I said 4 for 4 at that point, because it's so moving. And I think Maya Hawke at that point captures Flannery's pain and her agony so well. And it's so beautiful. And that's where it's at, because who of us doesn't suffer? And who of us doesn't want to be understood? And I think what Flannery so badly wanted was to do these two things: love God and be a great artist. And we do not have many models of people who are great artists and also saints.
Mm.
You know, I mean, the great artists, even like the Michelangelos, they're not canonized. I know, what's his name? Who's the guy who did all the paintings in the Dominican schools? He's a beatified, Frangelico.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But like Caravaggio, who's awesome, he killed the guy. And so we don't have a lot of artists who are, because they're so creative and they have so much passion in their heart. And she did, and she wanted to serve God and be a great artist. And I think she did it. So
Yeah.
that was go on.
No, I really love your take there about the misfit, the crucified misfit. It all makes sense. And there were a lot of times in the film too, like it talked about grace. You saw her praying. You saw kind of the vocation of the writer, you know, on display. Like she wanted to be the typewriter was what the movie, you know, let me be your typewriter. It was her prayer. You were talking about her suffering. And one of the memorable quotes for me was she said that a lot of people think faith is an electric blanket, but really it's the cross. That's what it is. And that's a powerful statement. And she understands that because of her suffering. Probably her most famous Catholic quote is, "If it's just a symbol, to hell with it." And it was about the Eucharist. That, you know, people talking about the Eucharist, oh, it's just a symbol of Christ's body and blood. And she truly believed in the real presence and transubstantiation as defined by St. Thomas Aquinas. So that's one of the popular quotes. I think if anybody's heard any quote of Flannery O'Connor, it's probably that. Where does that quote originate from? Is it in any of her stories, or was that just, as the movie showed, kind of in a casual conversation in a group? But what can she teach us about the Eucharist?
Yes. Well, a couple of things. The quote about the typewriter and much of that conversation that she has with her priest, that comes directly from a book called Prayer Journal. It was published, I think, in 2013. And she wrote a journal when she was at Iowa during those years that someone found in her archive, and then they actually published it. And it's super helpful. So Ethan Hawke, and the other guy's name is Gaines, who wrote the screenplay, they relied heavily upon her own words. And the same is true of that scene you just mentioned, Father. Although it took place in New York City, in the film it takes place in Iowa. It was at Mary McCarthy's house, but in the film it was at Robert Lowell's house. But that's not as important as what happened in this scene. So O'Connor's sitting around this table with a bunch of intellectuals, and they start to mock the Eucharist. And if you remember in the film, she's at the center of the table. It's almost like a scene of the Last Supper, and she's sitting a little bit pensive. And I think it's Elizabeth's in the film, but I think it was McCarthy who said, I think of the Eucharist as the most portable of the persons of the Trinity. When I was a girl, I thought I was receiving the Holy Ghost, and now I think of it as a symbol, and a pretty good one. And Flannery says, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. And then after that, although it was not part of the same conversation, the line you just said, what most people think is that religion is a big electric blanket, when in fact it's the cross. And then she says, and it's much harder to believe than not to believe. And they flip those two sentences around. But I'm so pleased. I don't know how much of a believer Ethan Hawke is. And I know Maya probably struggles a bit with her faith, but she did get into Juilliard by doing a monologue using O'Connor's prayer journal. But what I credit them doing is they were true to who O'Connor was, and they didn't try to make her in their image and likeness. She was faithful. I sent a copy of my book, in fact, to Maya Hawke, and I said, "You've done Flannery justice," because she did. She presented her as she is and was true to her words and her spirit. And I think it's great. That's a sign of a good actor.
Yeah. Wow.
But wait, I didn't answer your question about the Eucharist.
Oh, sure.
Let me answer that. So study O'Connor's life, and she started Mass every day with communion, right? So she went to Mass, and she was a faithful Catholic. If you read her letters, again, it's called a book called Habit of Being, you'll find out how funny she is and how faithful she was too. And she wasn't like a Teresa of Avila where she was heading off into mystic union with the Lord. She's pretty practical in her faith. She liked the rosary because it was tangible. She liked to read. She was pretty smart. She had good friends. And for me, she's become just a great model of what it means to be a Catholic and do what you're supposed to do and go to confession regularly, go to Mass and study hard and have good friends and let the Lord take care of things,
So she was a faithful Catholic. Is there any chance she'd ever be considered for canonization? Do people go on pilgrimages? Like, have you been to her grave down there in Georgia?
Yes, sir. I've been on many Flannery O'Connor pilgrimages, both with seminarians, with friends. If you're going to go, actually, he used to be really big on Twitter. His name was Tommy, and
Tommy Ty.
Tommy Ty. In his second book, it's like a collection of essays. I have an essay called How to Make a Flannery O'Connor Pilgrimage. So basically, you've got to go to two places. You got to go to Savannah, because that's where she was born. You could visit her childhood home and then go to the cathedral next door where she was baptized, confirmed, First Communion. And then you got to go to Milledgeville. You could visit her college. You could visit her church. You could visit her farm, and then you could visit her grave. And they're all worthy. And in fact, next year, so March 25th, 2025, O'Connor it'll be her 100th birthday. So I will be down in Georgia at that time, and I'm already starting to plan with a few friends to do a little pilgrimage down there. So yes, go down there and visit.
It seems like you should almost organize a formal event and bring a lot of people, Flannery O'Connor fans, together on that occasion.
Yeah, but then I'd have to organize it, and who wants to do that? It's a lot of work. I already have 3 jobs, so I don't want a 4th. But
sure.
Who knows? Maybe I'll see people down there. It'll be fun.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, this has been a great conversation, Father. I'm grateful that you took time out of your day. I have to run and teach now, but I teach middle school right now, religion. So, and one of the things I'm trying to teach the kids in religion is like to see God in ordinary moments of life, right? So like, just last week in a homily at Mass, I preached about, how in a book, like maybe we can find God somewhere like in the story of this book, this novel that you might be reading. Or, we went down, we saw some sturgeon. They were spawning at the river. And so I said, how did that remind you of God? Or what did that remind you of it from the scriptures? So that's what I'm trying to train these middle school students with, just to have their eyes open to faith at any moment. I think that's what Flannery O'Connor does, is that like in her stories, if you read them with the eyes of faith, it'll jump off the page for you.
Yeah. I can also say, as one of Flannery O'Connor's ambassadors, that she'd be so proud of you for, as busy as you are as a priest, to be making time for young people, because how important it is to see Christ in their priest, and to say he's making time for me. That means Jesus is making time for me. You're the one who brings the Eucharist and the sacraments to them. The fact that you're willing to go in the classroom and visit and let the young people get to know you and you them is a great grace. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Father, for taking time to share about Flannery O'Connor. I hope it'll be helpful to others as maybe they go see Wildcat in theaters, as they pick up her short stories. And for me, I'm going to give her a second chance. I'm going to give a read to some of those short stories. So pick up a copy of Father Damian Ference's book, From Word on Fire. I'll post links in the show notes. So thanks so much, Father, for joining me.
Awesome. Thank you, Father. pray for each other, huh?
Yeah, most definitely.
If you liked today's episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. And don't forget to stay up to date with what Father Edward is doing by following him on Facebook, X, or Instagram at the handle @FrEdwardLooney. Thanks for listening, and please join Father Edward again next time for another inspiring conversation.